Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the latest episode of the National Security Space Association's Spacetime Interview Series. My name is Chris Williams, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair of the Mormon Center for Space Studies in the association. Today, we're pleased to provide you with highlights of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2024. To help us understand these issues, we're delighted to have with us today two very talented national security space budget analysts, NSSA's own Mike Tierney and Mr. Todd Harrison. Thanks for your time today, gentlemen. Mike Tierney is Chief of Legislative Affairs at NSSA, where he leads our congressional educational outreach activities. Mike is well known for his timely and objective analysis of U.S. investments in national security space capabilities. He performs detailed analyses on legislative, regulatory, budget, and acquisition policies affecting the federal market. Many of our friends on Capitol Hill rely on Mike's thoughtful analyses to help guide their understanding of the intricacies of the military space budget. And Todd Harrison is Managing Director of Metrea Strategic Insights, where he leads the company's efforts to conduct innovative, insightful, and pathfinding research. Prior to joining Metrea in May of 2022, Todd was a senior fellow and the director of the Defense Budget Analysis and the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. At CSIS, he led the center's efforts to provide in-depth, nonpartisan research and analysis on defense spending, space security, and air power issues. Todd is also a highly valued member of NSSA's Board of Advisors. Quick word about our format. Todd will start us off with some highlights of the overarching DoD budget request. Then Mike will brief us on the FY24 budget request for national security space systems and programs. As with all space-time interviews, we strongly encourage audience participation. If you have a question for Todd or Mike, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll do my best to get through as many audience questions as possible. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the mic over to Todd Harrison, who will be followed by Mike Tierney. Todd, the floor is yours.
So before I dig into the defense budget, I'm just going to go to one of the charts I have in here that kind of captures the issue that they're facing. So, the standoff is you've got, some House Republicans demanding spending cuts, returning spending back to FY22 levels and trying to balance the overall federal budget within 10 years. And then, you've got Democrats who are saying, hey, we just need a clean increase of the debt ceiling so we don't risk default and we can discuss, budget issues later. What you also hear is a lot of people, pointing fingers and saying, oh, they want to cut Social Security or they want to cut Medicare or they're going to hurt defense spending, right? And then you hear people defending their position saying, no, that's not on the table. We wouldn't do that. Well, I find it interesting to then go through and say, okay, what are all the things that people are saying should be off the table? And let's look at it. So most politicians, if they care at all about getting reelected, they're going to take Social Security off the table. And then with that, Medicare, right? So that's healthcare for older people. And then Medicaid, that's healthcare for poor people, children. Of course, you don't want to cut veterans benefits and services. Some of that's in mandatory, some of that's in discretionary. You kind of have to pay interest. You don't have much choice in that, or you're in literal default. And then here is national defense. So if I just take those things off the table, which most politicians would take these things off the table, you're actually not left with a whole lot in the federal budget. And if you're going to try to institute some pretty steep cuts, and it only comes in these remaining programs, that's going to be unpalatable to a lot of people. And so that's kind of the standoff that we're at right now, is that if you want spending cuts, well, you got to break some glass if you're going to do that. And that's why, I'm looking at things like the defense budget. And while it is certainly not the largest part of the federal budget, it is one of the largest pieces of the federal budget. And as we learned from 2011, when we had another showdown over the debt ceiling, defense may not be immune from whatever compromise comes out of this in terms of overall budget cuts. Excuse me. All right. So let's dig in a little bit more to the defense budget and look at some of the longer term trends coming that we've seen in the budget and what they mean for the budget going forward. So this chart, I like to call it getting less for more. because it shows how we're spending more on defense and inflation-adjusted dollars for a relatively smaller force than we've had. So the columns here represent the DoD budget, and this is in constant $24, adjusting for inflation. The orange part of these columns, that's OCO spending. The green part is other supplemental spending. So those are temporary pieces of funding. But the blue shaded parts of it are the base defense budget. So the base defense budget for FY24 would be the highest it's ever been. Highest it's ever been in inflation adjusted dollars. The size of the force, though, is near the smallest it's ever been. Excuse me. So, what gives, right? Why has the budget been growing so much over the past 25 years? And the size of the force has not really grown. And in fact, it started to decline in recent years. I wish I could say that, it's more jobs are being done by the civilian workforce. The civilian workforce did have a bump with the whole acquisition reform initiative that started around 2009, but it doesn't explain the difference. It's not that we've been moving larger and larger parts of the force structure into the Guard and Reserve component. You can see that here. They've been basically flat, slightly down in recent decades. So what gives? And that's where the answer gets to be a little bit more difficult. And it is instructive for the types of challenges DoD is facing right now and is going to be facing in the near future. Before I dig into those reasons in a little bit more detail, I'm not going to go too deep on it. One of the other things I think is interesting about this budget request is the FYDP, the 5-year defense projection that comes out with the budget request. So this is for the total DoD budget. The light green line here is what they're projecting over the next 5 years. I like to tell people that, you never see straight lines in nature. You should never see straight lines in budgeting. If you do, it's man-made, it's forced, right? So it's pretty clear that they have been given a flat top line. This is flat and inflation adjusted dollars. It's perfectly flat if you go and look at the numbers. Now, what are the chances of that? Well, it means that this was forced. The DoD was told by OMB, you will live at this level, only growing with inflation for the coming years. That means that everything else you see in the FYDP, there's a little asterisk next to it, or should be in your mind, that not everything is probably accounted for here. Where they're showing, growth in a program's budget over the next 5 years. The asterisk there is, yeah, but there are lots of other accounts where they have probably not accounted for the growth that they're likely to see or even expecting. Now, the other lines you see here, the other green shaded lines, those are previous FYDP projections within the Biden administration. The blue shaded lines are from the Trump administration. The purple go back to the Obama administration. The black is where the budget ended up after Congress appropriated funds. So you can see a lot of shift in the 5-year planning horizon for DoD. It has gone up significantly from the 2 FYDPs submitted previously in the Biden administration, but it is probably not accounting for the real growth we're likely to see, especially if I filter it now for just O&M accounts. You can see they're projecting O&M is going to go down and kind of flatten out in future years. That is not likely to prove true, not unless we have a significant reduction in the size of the force. And MILPERS accounts for a little bit of growth in the next couple of years and then pretty modest growth in the future. Again, history has shown us that that's not likely to be true unless we downsize the force in a pretty significant way. Let's look at the Space Force's FYDP. If you look at the numbers here, this is published by OMB, not DoD. The Space Force is kind of up and down over time, but it's projected to stay roughly at the current level of just under 30 billion a year in future years. That is a plus up, a significant plus up from what had previously been projected in the PB23 request. And of course, the previous 2 requests before that had the Space Force basically staying flat at where it initially started once it was separated out as an independent service. So a lot of interesting trends there and a lot of unknown factors, I would say, in the 5-year projection. Now, getting back to the larger trend that I talked about earlier, the budget is at a record high level. The size of the force is near a record low level. What's driving that? Just quickly here, it's a combination of factors. One is that personnel costs are a lot higher than they used to be. The cost per active service member grew significantly in the 2000s. It has leveled out recently, but it looks like it may be making an uptick in this budget request. We'll see what happens in future years and what Congress does to military compensation. The average cost per civilian within the department also grew much more modestly than we saw on the military side. The cost per civilian, though, has actually flattened out and declined slightly in recent years. Another major factor is the cost of operating and sustaining our forces. Here, this just looks at O&M cost per person in the federal budget. In the DOD budget. Doing it on a per person basis normalizes it for the size of the force, because force structure generally moves in proportion to active duty in strength. So looking at O&M per person, of course, there was a big spike here in the 2000s due to Iraq and Afghanistan. Those operations were primarily funded out of O&M. But even neglecting that period, we have seen pretty sustained growth in O&M cost per person. And here we are now, where we're out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and we still see O&M per person at near a record high level. And that's only what they budgeted for in FY24, not where they're likely to actually end up for the year. O&M costs, on a per person basis, typically grow about 2.6% per year above inflation. So if you just want to maintain the same size force in the future, that O&M fight up that I showed you before, instead of going down, it should actually be growing over time, faster than inflation. But we don't see that yet in this fight up. Now, acquisition funding is where it always gets interesting. The purple line here is procurement funding over time. The blue line is R&D funding over time. You can see the very different types of cycles, procurement, lots of ups and downs, depending on the overall budget cycle for DOD. The RDT&E budget is more like step functions. It goes up, but then it doesn't go down that much in the drawdown periods. Right now, we're at the highest level of RDT&E spending for the department that we've ever seen in inflation-adjusted dollars, but also as a percentage of the overall DOD budget. And if you look at this, if you break it down by the military departments, for the Department of the Air Force, which of course now includes the Space Force, RDT&E is actually going to exceed procurement this year. We have not seen that happen in the past for the Air Force. And so this is a relatively new trend. What that suggests is we've got a whole lot of programs in the development pipeline. That's why they're being funded through RDT&E right now. And what we should expect to see in the future is that those programs will increasingly shift their funding into procurement, and we'll see the procurement budget grow by even more. The risk there is if programs aren't able to transition into procurement, and we could be stuck, trying to defer another modernization bow wave, which has grown increasingly and nearly impossible to do at this point. So there are a lot of bills still coming due in procurement, particularly for the Air Force. Now, I won't go too deep into this because Mike is going to talk about it a lot more, but this chart actually allows you to go through and look for different line items and program elements in the RDT&E budget and procurement budgets. The top charts here show the overall projection for these accounts over the FYDP compared to previous budget requests. So you see RDT&E keeps inching up. Every budget request is coming in at a higher and higher level. But the other interesting trend is RDT&E FYDPs tend to show declining budgets in future years, right? They're never fully accounting for all the programs that they keep coming back with year after year, right? They keep showing that they're going to decline. Procurement, different trend here. It is showing some growth over the FYDP, but not as much as we would expect to see, given how much money is going into research and development right now. Down below, this is program element by program element, line item by line item. They are sorted by the total amount of funding they have projected over the FYDP. Unreported, that is mainly just classified programs that don't submit a FYDP, but we can tell what their funding is in aggregate because it's the difference between the overall top line over the FYDP and all the details that are reported for unclassified programs. So we can see that classified funding is pretty robust over the FYDP, no surprise there. Just a few highlights before I hand it over back over to Chris and over to Mike to go into detail on the space side, but a few highlights on the non-space side. The largest single program element in RDT&E that's not classified is the Air Force's NGAD program. If you go and see the details here, what is surprising is they are now projecting at the end of the FYDP that funding is really going to soar to over $7 billion per year just for the NGAD program. That is being driven by the collaborative combat aircraft that you can see here. Of that $7.2 billion they're projecting for FY28, about $3 billion of that will be for the CCA. So that is no small program at all. Related to that, the Navy has actually revealed in this budget request what this Link Plumeria line is. In the past, Link Plumeria just had this description that it's classified. But this year they added a project item under it called Next Generation Fighter. So what this is it's the Navy's NGAD. And that also is projected to go up to about $2.7 billion per year in development funding by the end of the FYDP. So big aircraft fighter acquisition programs here are entering the pipeline. We had not seen that, not to this magnitude in previous budget requests. A few other highlights. One, the carrier replacement program. You see a big sum of money here projected for FY28. If you go in and look at the details in that program, they show that they're going to actually procure their next carrier. It'll be the fourth of the Ford class. But what got my attention was they're projecting the total cost of that next carrier will be $17.3 billion. It's not all paid for at once, of course. But that is a huge increase in the cost of aircraft carriers, where the previous Ford class carriers were running around 12, 13 billion each. And one other insight here, this is the first time we got to see the procurement projection for the new ICBM, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program. And what I find interesting about that is how quickly they are ramping up production. It's going to get up to about what's that, 6.5 billion per year, and a production rate of 56 missiles per year. That's what they're projecting for that program. Of course, you know, if you know the whole history of the ICBMs and the Minuteman III and how they're aging out, that is going to be necessary. We're going to have to achieve that level to replace these missiles in time. But I point out these other non-space programs to show that there are some huge bills coming in the acquisition pipeline. And so it's kind of remarkable to see how well the Space Force did, given all these other bills that are in there, to see the new types of programs and the expanded programs that we see in the Space Force's acquisition budget. I'm going to pause there, hand it back over to you, Chris, and let Mike go into the details.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. Both valuable information and the display that you have for showing that, and the interactive display is extraordinarily valuable. I should note for folks that both sets of slides, Todd's and Mike's, are on the NSSA website as we speak. So please make use of those. Let me turn it over now to Mike Tierney.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Todd. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I see a lot of familiar faces on the participant side. This is about the maybe 6th or 7th year that Todd and I have been doing this together as kind of a tag team punch. And I really enjoy doing it with Todd because he's always, you know, even if I've done this last week with him, I'm learning something new this week. And so, you know, my objective is to do a little bit of a deeper dive onto the space component of the total DoD budget. just kind of dovetailing off of what Todd had highlighted, he highlighted record high budget for DOD, record high RDT&E, and spoiler alert, a lot of that applies to the space budget and Space Force in particular. So next slide, please. So this is our kind of overview slide to give some top level macro funding levels for the DoD space budget. The overall top line, the dark blue that you see, is a combination of all the services below. Space Force will remain the largest, vast majority of this total DoD space budget. It has transitioned over time, like a little bit, as services divest some of their program management in the space domain. But as you can see, the trend here is, in my view, remarkable of how much this budget has grown over just the 4 years, really, that you see on this slide. In fiscal year 21, on the far left, you can see that the Space Force budget was $15 billion. That was effectively the enacted amount, but that was effectively the first budget year request of Space Force with its own budget, accounting and program line nomenclature. And that was about $15 billion. And here in fiscal 24, the request is $30 billion. So in a 4-year period, the Space Force has doubled its effective budget. And a lot of that is attributable to some transfers, but really the vast majority of that growth is organic growth relative to the programs, the missions, the technologies, the threat environment that this budget supports. It's not simply, a new service growing its budget from transferring in other services. There's some real growth going on here. Also on this slide, I wanted to highlight the second column from the right, the FY23 enacted number, just to highlight here that Congress, even if you look at the 23 requests, 26 billion, 24 for Space Force, they again plussed up on top of what was a sizable year-over-year request increase in 23, going from 18 to 24. They gave it an additional $2 billion on top of that. So that is to put into context that, space is relatively unique in the sense that the threat environment is driving the technology and missions, which is driving the budget, which has bipartisan, bicameral political support on Capitol Hill for these robust investments that are needed. Last thing I want to highlight on this slide is you will see, if you look at the far left and you compare the values for the other services, defense-wide, Army, Air Force, and Navy, you'll see that, with the growth that has occurred over these 4 years, those services have relatively remained flat. So it's not as if the Space Force has grown at the expense of these other services. And I think that highlights just the organic growth. Next slide, please. So $30 billion top line for Space Force. That's, an increase of almost $4 billion over the enacted amount, which again, the enacted amount was $2 billion over the requested amount in 23. So, historic growth really, and continued historic growth for the Space Force. When we look at that growth of 3.9 billion, we always want to see, within that year-to-year growth, where is that growth coming from? And we have this little breakdown here for you that shows that, there is some organic new funding, new programs, new projects, new activities that were not in the previous Space Force budget that appear for the first time. That's about $500 million of the $4 billion increase. There are some pretty minor transfers in from the other services in this budget request, some from the Army, I believe one from the Navy as well. But the real bulk of that increase is coming from organic USSF, Space Force programmatic increases. Where are those programs? What is the nature of those programs? That's a lot of what this briefing will be about. But the big takeaway is that it's a huge investment in the missile warning, missile tracking capabilities inside of the Space Force. The Space Force has a number of different platforms and architectures to attack this missile warning, missile tracking threat that are dispersed through Space Systems Command, SSC, the acquisition arm of the Space Force, as well as the Space Development Agency, which last year moved into the Space Force, but has a little bit of a different mandate relative to SSC's mandate, but both have responsibility for the missile warning, missile tracking mission. SSC predominantly or exclusively kind of in the MEO orbitology, and Space Development Agency focusing on the missile warning, missile tracking capability in LEO. But that is, almost $5 billion in the 24 request alone for this missile warning, missile tracking capability. This was a kind of a new initiative, appeared for the first time in 23, on top of, the next gen SBIRS investments, on top of the existing SDA, Space Development Agency programs. In 23, this missile warning, missile tracking architecture was newly added, and it's again here in the 24 request and very robustly funded. Looking just at Space Development Agency, they're working on Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 transport and tracking for missile warning. And in fiscal year 24, their total budget kind of across both their organic SDA activities and the new missile warning, missile tracking efforts is $4.6 billion. And to kind of follow Todd's theme of giant programs in the budget, Space Development Agency budget across the FYDP is $20 billion. And, every time I brief this, I have to go back to 3 or 4 years ago when Space Force was being stood up and Space Development Agency was being proposed. There was a lot of questions about the viability of both of them, whether or not SDA would survive, whether or not it had the political support. The bottom line is that it absolutely does. It's been transitioned into the Space Force, but certainly from a budgeting standpoint, the Space Force, Air Force is giving Space Development Agency in the request all that it's needed with $20 billion over the FYDP. When we first briefed this 4 years ago, I think the request was either 49 million or 149 million, something well below 200 million though, for Space Development Agency in fiscal year 21. That has grown to 4.6 billion in 24 and 20 billion across the FYDP to support those missions. As I referenced in the little chart above, there is some new funding that is basically brand new funding inside of the Space Force's own programs, one for ground moving target indicator, and then there's a new Space Force IT data analytics and digital solutions initiative inside of the Air Force Satellite Control Network line, which does warrant highlighting in the sense that it's one of the main priorities of the Space Force is securing basically the data transport architecture for the Space Force overall architecture. There's a couple of transfers in. Army transferred the Joint Tactical Ground System into the Space Force, but again, really the large bulk of the increases is coming from organic Space Development Agency, missile warning, missile tracking, and the stuff I'm about to brief. Next slide, please. This slide comes from the Air Force's budget briefing. And we provided to kind of give you a context. First off, they call it their operational imperatives. These, highlighted platforms and missions are what they consider to be kind of their operational imperatives in this budget moving forward. I highlight, in the center of the page there is the next gen fighter that Todd referenced, the NGAD family of systems. But really, why we're here is the space element, which you see in the top left corner there, kind of as the overlay across all of the airborne, naval, and terrestrial capabilities that they support. So missile warning, missile tracking is one of their operational imperatives, space sensing, space data transport, and you see offensive space and resilient space order of battle. Next slide, please. So the way that we like to break down the 30 billion, right, the total USSF budget request, is to do it as much as we can on a mission and portfolio basis that aligns to the way that Space Force and Space Systems Command look at the world, which is to say that they have at SSC PEOs that are responsible for certain mission sets. And so we have gone in and identified at the program element, project and activity basis, which of the budget elements kind of align to those PEOs. So this chart, this way of breaking it down is proprietary in the sense that it's not provided to us by the department. It's something that we've kind of organically created. But it allows you to see really where the bulk of the funding is at the kind of mission portfolio basis. and see that the real big rocks, in this 30 billion, you see this, the 4.6 for Space Development Agency, the 4 billion for missile warning, missile tracking, space sensing, next gen OPIR. Comms and PNT is the other really big rock. And these align, all these ones that I'm referencing at the outset here, align to kind of PEOs at the SSC level. Assured access to space, AATS is assured access to space. That's your, NSSL launch and small launch. That's 2.5 billion. The ones that don't align to the PEOs, but are also really important to highlight here, are the classified line at the bottom. You see, since it doesn't align to the PEOs and we don't have a breakout, we've kind of moved it to the bottom there, but it's a $7 billion request in 24 for Space Force, RDT&E. And if you can just look to the left there to see the growth inside of that account over just the past 3 fiscal years, we've gone from 4.56 billion up to 7 billion in the classified account. The bullets on the right are highlights that have been provided, effectively copied and pasted from the Space Forces and Air Force's budget briefing to provide kind of with the context of what they highlight. There's some different ways of looking at it. They here in their second budget highlight an addition of 243 million for next gen OPIR. When I get into the space sensing portfolio summary, I'll give a different way of highlighting kind of some of the news inside of that portfolio. But this is the way that they kind of look at the world. You see SDA, next gen OPIR, missile warning, missile tracking, comms, and ESS is a comms program, communications program. PTS, another comms program. So this is really like the way that they look through and highlight the lens. And then on a portfolio basis, we'll go through and highlight what we saw kind of as the highlights. Next slide, please. We provide this org chart just to kind of reinforce that last message I was giving about the PEOs and our alignment there too, relative to the budgets that you see. The light blue arena on the far left there are the PEOs that have the acquisition authority, and that's what we try and align our mission sets to as much as possible. Next slide, please. So I know Todd, referenced a FIDEP look. This is always a challenge for us from a methodology standpoint, because as Todd said, it's impartial information provided by the government. So our methodology, what we've kind of deferred to when we're looking at the Space Force, is that we take just the lines where on like an individual line item basis, they at least provide a projected FIDEP, something that, to Todd's earlier point, may not have like really great fidelity, but at least it's provided where we can see that on a programmatic basis, there's an accountability for where the FIDEP for that program is headed. And so that's procurement largely, RDT&E largely, but what it excludes are the individual, the classified FIDEP, the O&M FIDEP, and the MilPERS FIDEP. But when you take all of that out and you're left with just the procurement and RDT&E programs that USSF kind of gives a FIDEP for, you can see that it kind of similarly tracks to what Todd had briefed on his slides, a decline, but then some out-year growth. But generally speaking, relatively flat across the FIDEP. That's relatively important now, with all the caveats that we've removed a lot of the data here, but with also the reinforcement of Todd's message that the FIDEP exercise in and of itself is a bit of a low fidelity exercise. That said, Congress will look at this FIDEP, right? And Congress in the FY23 appropriations bill raised a lot of concern over the methodology that the Space Force and Department of the Air Force were using to provide budget numbers and the request and the FIDEP projections, and basically said, look, we're here to support you. You've got a lot of investments for missile warning, missile tracking, and the next gen of our architectures, but your FIDEP just doesn't match it. Your FIDEP does not reflect the great investment that would be needed to support those architectures. So if they look at something, the Congress looks at something like this, they may not see that story that they're looking for, which is a architecture that is funded across the FIDEP. To Todd's earlier point, though, this exercise on the FIDEP is very low fidelity, but it's a question that we are often asked. What does the FIDEP for Space Force look over? And this is our best way of kind of coming up with that answer. Next slide, please. So I know we're running, I've got a little bit of time here left. I will try and do my best to kind of go through each one of these mission portfolios and just highlight kind of the big moving rocks, and so we can get to your questions. And we're going through these portfolios kind of on a relative size and scope of magnitude, not entirely, but we're starting with space sensing. It's one of the largest mission portfolios that I briefed earlier, but it's also really the focus kind of this budget. And from my perspective, from a Space Force investment strategy, there's a lot of money going into missile warning, missile tracking, and space sensing. As I alluded to earlier on a couple slides ago, when the Space Force and Air Force highlights the news on Next Gen OPIR, they said they added $243 million. But the reality is that this budget request, it creates a new kind of architecture for Next Gen OPIR. This is our overhead persistent infrared radar system. This is a large investment, government owned and operated system. First, from a organization standpoint, per congressional direction, the budget splits this into 4 effective sub-programs inside of the Next Gen OPIR bigger bin. Polar and GEO, last year in the budget request, the architecture had projected 3 satellites in GEO and 2 in Polar. The real new news to me in this budget request is not the addition of $243 million, but the cancellation of the 3rd GEO satellite. That's a $975 million decrease to cut that satellite. And the Department and Space Force did provide a rationale for that, saying that the continued performance of the existing SBIRS constellation and the anticipated full operational capability of this MEO-LEO missile warning, missile tracking constellation that is co-funded and managed by SSC and SDA is enough to cancel that 3rd GEO satellite, that they have enough confidence in the full operational capability of MEO-LEO missile warning. That is one issue that I think Congress, as we are very, on the precipice here of markup, I'll be very interested to see if that cut in the request is sustained by the Hill, or are they remaining concerned over too many eggs in the MEO-LEO missile warning, missile tracking bin, and they may want to hedge their bets on that capability. We'll see. But that was one of the ones I wanted to highlight on here. The last bullet I thought was also important because I think Todd alluded to it, that a lot of these these RDT&E programs will be entering a phase of procurement down the road. And we just thought it was interesting that there is a procurement line that is the partner line for the RDT&E investments for resilient missile warning, missile tracking. In the budget, however, it doesn't project any funding for it until fiscal year 25. So to Todd's point, that kind of will show you when some of this missile warning, missile tracking investment is expected to transition from development into actual procurement. Next slide, please. I did cover Space Development Agency, I think a lot at the outset. It's a sizable investment. Just one note as you're looking at these slides, when we say an additional, that is over the 23 enacted amount. So, this is what 23 enacted, finished for this project program activity, and we see these additions on top of that in the 24 request. Space Development Agencies has some launch funding. They have their own launch line now. This budget request funds 5 launches at $529 million, about $100 million to launch. When we get into the assured access to space slide, you'll see that cost increases on a per launch basis to about $200 million. But they're really different capabilities, different launch capabilities, different ways of doing business on the launch side for both SDA and the organic capabilities. So not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, and wanted to make sure we highlighted that. Next slide, please. We're going to kind of burn through these. 2-something billion for 10 launches. Again, this is an account, the NSSL launch account, that funds, across mission, across services, whether it's the intelligence community or an organic Space Force asset that needs to be launched. This funding line funds all of those launches. This is a pretty high launch cadence year from a budget request standpoint. As Todd alluded in his, it's very cyclical on the launch side in particular, where they don't need to launch anything because the satellite's not ready, but then another year, 3 or 4 come online. So we have a very high launch cadence, at least the request side of 10 launches in this fiscal year through a combination of the need to procure launches for the intelligence community and Space Force. Last thing on shared access to space, this has been something that Congress has been pressing the Department and Space Force on, which is tactically responsive space to complement effectively the NSSL, the National Security Space Launch Mission, a smaller, more responsive class of launch missions that are meant to reconstitute degraded capability in the time of a conflict. Congress has been repeatedly funding that through congressional aid each fiscal year. This budget request, for the first time in all of that advocacy, despite repeated congressional direction, does request funds for tactically responsive space, $30 million in fiscal year 24, which Congress will love. Congress will not love that they did not fund it at all, basically across the FYDP, and they had direction from Congress to fund that mission across the FYDP. So they'll have to justify that move. Next slide, please. Communications and PNT, this bucket funds, the comms missions, which are a kind of tiered system of, increasing protection. Evolved Strategic SATCOM being like the most protected, but there are some, important initiatives to highlight in here, kind of in the PTW, PTES, PTS front, which is the protected tactical layer of communications, kind of one layer below that nuclear hardened command and control that ESSS provides. And there are some commercial related initiatives inside of this budget request to basically take the PTW waveform, the protected tactical waveform, and get it working through commercial SATCOM systems. And there's $30 million in the budget request for that. We're running a little low on time. Let's go to the next slide, please. Battle Management Command and Control. Again, I wanted to highlight there is a new project for cyber secure mission data transport. This is definitely one of the themes kind of throughout the budget, is securing that data transport architecture and the overall architecture. And you see it here with a new investment inside of the AFSCN, continuing to fund enterprise ground services at a pretty robust level. Enterprise ground services being kind of an initiative to create a common operating ground system as much as possible to eliminate Guardians having to be trained to operate each individual, satellite capability from a ground station's perspective. So that's an initiative that they're moving forward with. Next slide. Space domain awareness and combat power. The space domain awareness portfolio inside of Space Force's budget is largely a terrestrial radar-based, looking up from Earth out into space. The deep space advanced radar concept being that, but there is a joint NRO USSF program called Silent Barker, which is the follow-on to SBSS, I believe. That is a space-based space domain awareness initiative. I also wanted to highlight there's a new project inside of this portfolio, $18 million for commercial data buys inside of the space domain awareness portfolio. There is some inside the unified data library, some organic funding in the order of magnitude of $5, $6 million, $7 million to buy commercial space domain awareness data. This is a new project to do on top of that an additional $18 million, which I know that Congress and industry has been looking for. Next slide, please. So this is one portfolio just to kind of highlight that this is where we diverge from kind of PEO alignment. There is no advanced R&D PEO inside of SSC, but there are these kind of catch-all RDT&E lines that provide investment funding and development funding across the mission portfolios that I just briefed, right, on the PEO level, where it's much more difficult to kind of bin them directly into any single PEO. And you see at the first bullet there, the kind of 6 flavors of the different types of missions that are supported here through these kind of advanced R&D buckets. Next slide, please. Organizational investments, there are some budget lines that don't really necessarily fund technology development per se, but are some of the overhead and organizational investments, things like overhead funding for the SWAC, actual specific funding to perform analyses by the SWAC, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center. This is the, relatively new organization that has been tasked with developing, the architectures of the future. And, to be frank, in FY23, I think Congress said, SWAC, we want to see your work a lot more. So it would be really shocking to see, Congress do anything but support additional funding for SWAC to give them the resourcing that they need to perform the additional analyses that they're asking for. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Is that it? So with that, we will turn to questions.
Fantastic. Thanks to both of you. Tremendous presentations, just chock full of very useful, actionable data. Let me ask Todd the first question here. Put on pull out your crystal ball here for a second. Where do you think the Congress is going to come out on defense spending, the top line? I know it's hard to project at this point. There are a lot of moving parts, but what's your best guess at this point as to how this will all play out?
Well, let me throw a conditional probability here, right? So let's assume we get through this debt ceiling negotiation or whatever they want to call it relatively cleanly, right? And we do not end up with something like the Budget Control Act or some severe cuts in overall discretionary spending. Assuming that does not happen within the next month or so, if we get into the fall and it's just a debate about overall federal spending and defense is part of that, I think the sentiment is still pretty good, pretty strong on the overall defense budget. I don't think the spigot is quite as wide open as it was the past couple of years, but I could see Congress coming in and adding 20 or 30 billion overall to the DoD request. Now, the big caveat is, like I said before, assuming we make it through the debt ceiling debate without some sort of, fiscal constraint that binds the Congress when they get to negotiating appropriations this fall. It's entirely possible that they do agree to some, flattening of federal spending or even a reduction in federal spending, in which case the prospects for Congress adding money to this defense budget request quickly get erased. Important caveat there, but if it was just defense appropriations on its own, I think we would be looking at another pretty decent increase by Congress above what's in the request.
Thank you. We'll hold you to it, and we'll be back at you late in the year. Hopefully, we won't see another continuing resolution, given the dramatic negative consequences that has on the department, for sure. Let me shift to Mike. And Mike, you touched on this in your presentation. You referenced some of the criticisms that were leveled by the appropriators, and I'll just read one comment they had from their bill, their report. The committee's report stated, the Space Force's ambitious plans for new architectures, programs, and mission areas do not appear to be backed up with credible budget projections in the out years to actually deliver these capabilities. Again, you sort of touched on this, but to what extent do you think the significant increases that we've seen in the budget, including for FY24, allays those concerns, or do you think there's still sort of underlying concerns about the way they do their planning and budgeting, and when you look at the out years, as you noted, and Todd noted, some slight declines, for example. What's the reaction going to be on the appropriations committees to that, those numbers and those trend lines?
It's a great question. I know that it was, I think House appropriators and Senate appropriators were pretty clear in that message that they want the SWAC to show their work. Whether or not that actually appears in the budget request, right, in the FYDP and in the budget justification materials is one question. And just from my ability to look at a public release and find what data is available, that's one story. And I don't think that story tells the story that Congress wants to hear in terms of the FYDP projections and the necessary investment. But I'm hopeful that in staffer briefing days, when they brief Congress and brief the professional staff, whether it's in the classified budget, whether it's in the O&M budget that I can't see, see the FYDP for, that they may have improved. But to Todd's earlier point, this is not just a USSF problem, right? Or a Space Warfighting Analysis Center problem. This is a DoD problem relative to fidelities of FYDPs. I do think it's important for the Space Force to listen to Congress on this because they've been so supportive. That quote you just read was also supported with $2 billion over what they asked for. So the degree of concern is mitigated to a certain extent. Over.
Thank you. Todd, you touched on this, or both of you touched on it, I think, a little bit, and that is whether to what extent the Space Force is living up to its motto of buy before build, and especially as it relates to commercial space capabilities. What overall grade would you give them at this point for leveraging commercial space capabilities? And do you sense that that's going to get real? And if so, when will it get real? You've mentioned, Mike, some particular areas, some purchases of data in the space domain awareness area, et cetera, but certainly more can be done in that area. And if you guys have comments on how best to leverage commercial, sure, they would love to hear it.
Yeah, I'll start by saying I think that I'm going to cop out a little bit here, Chris, and give them an incomplete, in the sense that it also allows me to highlight that we have a NSSA Spacetime, I believe, later this week with Colonel Rich Nisley of the Commercial Services Office inside of SSC. I think that's on Thursday, so encourage everybody that's on this to, if they're interested on the commercial side, that should be a great use of your time. But he really has an opportunity because, like I've briefed before, there are definitely these little pockets of investment inside of these mission sets, right? 18 million for commercial over PTW over commercial data buys for space domain awareness. But the disconnect really, I think, is just with the expectation on industry. If you picture a Venn diagram of capability, right, with the government on one side, commercial on the other. If you ask industry, they think that they overlap greatly, right, in terms of where that overlap in the Venn diagram is. I think the government sees it as a lot less of an overlap, and I think Colonel Nisley and the ComSo office have an opportunity to kind of clarify where that boundary lies in the government's mind. And if we can get alignment in terms of expectations, I think we'd have a lot, a better of a dialogue between commercial and government about where the right areas are. There's certainly greater opportunities for investment on the commercial side. They're never going to fully outsource and, give up ownership and control. And that's something that I think, on a mission by mission basis, commercial needs to come to reality with. Over. Todd?
Yeah, no, this is something I have some strong opinions about. I might not be quite as generous as Mike in giving it incomplete. I see the point. That's my initial inclination to say, well, it's incomplete because they haven't really shown us their plan for how they're going to fully leverage commercial. So let's see the plan first. But they've been talking about it for so long, and they've had so long to really come up with a comprehensive plan for how the Space Force is going to properly leverage commercial space capabilities that I think, once you blow past the due date long enough, you have to start docking points, right? And so at this point, I give them something like a C, not an F, because they are effectively leveraging commercial in some ways. Great example is in launch. The way the national security launch, acquisition is structured, it is effectively buying a commercial launch service. I think that's great. And that's a huge amount of money that we're talking about there. The DoD separate really from the Space Force, they inherited this from DISA, but they do a lot of contracting for commercial SATCOM. And that's been going on for decades, really. But you look at the Space Force itself, and where could it be leveraging commercial space services in all kinds of ISR, electro-optical imagery, space-based radar, RF sensing, right? You can kind of go down the list. On-orbit servicing of satellites, it's commercial now. I don't really see much of a plan at all. And most importantly, I don't see it in the budget request. And if you want to be credible and signal to industry that you're serious about using commercial space services where appropriate, because it doesn't work for everything, but where appropriate, we should see that in the FYDP. We should see programs in there. We should see real funding streams. And for the most part, we're not seeing that. And so, I think that the Commercial Space Office has got a lot of work to do to catch up to where commercial space companies already are and are kind of expecting the Space Force to meet them there. The one thing of caution I would note is you've got a lot of commercial companies that are out there that have built capabilities that are waiting to be leveraged. They can't wait forever. They're going to have to move on either to other customers, other missions, or they're just going to fade away. And the Space Force could lose this opportunity to leverage what a lot of private capital has already invested in building that really could be useful for the Space Force. The other thing I would point out, though, is there are some ways where they're leveraging commercial but not leveraging commercial space services. The Space Development Agency is buying commercial-based satellite buses, things like that. So they absolutely are leveraging some commerciality, but they're not leveraging commercial space services. So it's really part of the advantage of commercial, not the whole advantage.
Well, thank you both. And Todd, you referenced space launch. We know you have a major study you're working on and will soon reveal to the world, share with us in this area. And I would love to here and now invite you to a space-time interview where you can share some of the results of that study. We look forward to its release and hope to have you back soon. I guess the last question I have for each of you is a softball, which is what surprised you most about the request, either at the top line DoD request or the Space Force request in particular? And what do you sense as the major outcomes from this year's congressional deliberations with respect to the FY24 request? Do you in general believe that both the budget request number and key programs will be ratified, validated, authorized, appropriated? Or do you think where do you think there might be some differences between the Congress and the administration in these areas? And Todd, why don't we start with you and then we'll end with Mike.
Sure. I mean, I think there were, pockets of surprises like the flat FYDP projection for DoD, only growing with inflation, like perfectly, only growing with inflation. That was a bit of surprise given how much they had tried to emphasize that this was a strategy-driven budget, because that certainly indicates it's not, it's budget-driven. But probably the single biggest surprise was that aircraft carrier buying a new Ford class carrier for $17.3 billion. It does make you question a lot of things. What is going on, and is that really going to be worth it? And where else could that money be spent rather than an aircraft carrier that is, it's a floating target. Yeah, so I mean, that for me was the biggest surprise in there. In terms of the outlook for it, I've got a lot of uncertainty this year about how this budget year is going to work out. Hopefully we get through this debt ceiling debate relatively unscathed, but I think there are all sorts of scenarios we've got to be seriously thinking about, of government shutdown at the beginning of the fiscal year, an actual default on obligations where the government cannot pay its bills, but still has appropriations, so it's not a shutdown. And of course, the ever-present and highly likely risk of an extended continuing resolution. You look back in history, since the fiscal year has started on October 1st, about 80% of the years we have begun, in DoD at least, the fiscal year on a continuing resolution. I think this might be one of those years where it ends up being, kicked down the road, maybe 6 months, maybe halfway through the fiscal year, if they can't reach agreement on some of these big, debt and overall federal budget issues. So I see a lot of uncertainty coming for us in this fiscal year.
Thank you, Todd. Or excuse me, Mike.
Yeah, and I think aside from the overall top line being yet another for Space Force and DoD being another year of increasing, which I guess doesn't really come as a huge shock. We kind of saw that coming. To me, it's the Space Development Agency's $20 billion FYDP. It's also the tactically responsive space launch mission being inside of the budget. That means Congress is listening. That means the department is listening to Congress in some of their direction. Relative to the outcome, I have confidence that, again, there's been bicameral, bipartisan support from authorizers and appropriators kind of across the board for this portfolio, notwithstanding some of the top line pressures that Todd alluded to. I do think, space at the end of the day will continue to be a winner. Whether or not Congress are getting the level of detail and justification and rationalization and analysis that they need to justify these investments is the open question to me. And I think we will see that in language kind of when these marks start coming out here in the next couple of weeks.
Well, thank you. And sadly, we're out of time. Todd and Mike, thanks very much for your thoughtful presentations. You guys are the best in the business, and it shows. We also thank our audience, of course, and we appreciate your participation, your probing questions. Please visit us on the NSSA website, which is www.nssaspace.org. There you can find many useful reports, links to previous unclassified space-time interviews, and other valuable materials. And as I mentioned a moment ago, both Todd's slides and Mike's will be on the website here momentarily, if they're not there already. And as Mike mentioned, on Thursday of this week, beginning at 1 o'clock, we will conduct another unclassified space-time interview with Colonel Rich Nisley, who serves as the Senior Materiel Leader, Commercial Space Office at Space Systems Command. Hope you can join us for that important event. And with that, thanks again for joining us today for this highly informative space-time interview with Todd and Mike. Again, you guys are really on your know your briefs well. It's always great to see you both and keep up the fine work. Thank you very much for attending, and everyone have a great day. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.